Thank you, Mr. Chair. And in Minnesota, and my district borders Canada, heavy ag district, we really do know how important those relationships with our Canadian neighbors are for business and for farms. However, I do think that our trade should at least be fair for our American producers. And you can probably guess I heard a lot about the dairy issues in USMCA in my district. Many of my farmers supported USMCA because they really thought that we needed to update those agricultural trade issues, and it's important that we increase the dairy market and the access to Canada. And like you mentioned, Ambassador Doud, it is critically important that that American dairy producers have a fair opportunity to compete with, in particular here in neighboring Canada. And I am disappointed that Canada continues to keep U.S. producers from playing on a level field when it comes to filling the USMCA dairy tariff rate quotas. I have to slow down so I get all my words in. And Ambassador Doud, I'm going to throw out a few questions really quickly, and I'd just like you to speak to some of that. Can you speak to the importance of access to foreign markets for U.S. agriculture, and how do exports relate to commodity prices? And then how can stepped-up trade enforcement ensure new and continued access to export markets? And I'm just going to throw that about 3.5 minutes, and you're going to cover all of that perfectly in that time.
Well, you know, in dairy, 44% of our dairy goes to Canada and Mexico, so obviously USMCA is a critical thing. With the CAFTA-DR, on January 1, our tariff finally, after all these years, went to 0 for dairy. And I think to look at CAFTA-DR and say, well, was that a success? Well, over these years, we've taken our dairy trade from 40 million to 440 million. So obviously, these free trade agreements are a big deal. When we started with Mexico, it was 181 million in 1994. Today, it's 2.5 billion. So obviously, number one, trade deals are very important. Number two, the next thing I would say is trade enforcement is critically important. You know, the very first trade enforcement in the WTO was beef hormones with the EU. And going back to the EU, you mentioned them, very interesting situation where rather than fix the problem, they agreed to pay compensation. They've never fixed the problem. They have no interest in fixing the problem. They're protectionists. This is how they do business. And this is an incredibly difficult thing for U.S. farmers to have to deal with. We're very competitive in the world. In fact, that's part of the challenge is we scare other countries and their farmers about this. But I actually, last summer, had a very interesting conversation with the Chinese ambassador about this. And I said, our goal is to make the pie bigger, expand consumption of food around the world in hopes that we increase U.S. exports and U.S. trade of that consumption. So we're trying to increase trade, increase the diets of consumers around the world, increase protein, and that's our advantage in the U.S. is on the protein side.
And just maybe just comment on the effect on prices, on commodity prices, because that obviously that's a huge issue to everybody.
Well, I believe it was Senator Dole that once said you get in agriculture you have to sell it or smell it. And that's the way we look at it in agriculture. 18% of our dairy is exported. On the pork side, I think it's 25%. Beef is, 15 to 20%. Wheat is half. Soybeans. Everything that we do, we grow in abundance in this country. We're completely dependent on our ability to sell it to other customers around the world.
Well, and I appreciate that. And with that, Mr. Chair, I will yield back.